a city on edge. The air buzzed with the restless hum of an American city teetering between progress and unease. Downtown streets brimmed with life. A mosaic of cultures reflected in vibrant murals, open-air markets, and the smoky scent of barbecue wafting from family-owned restaurants. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered, unspoken but palpable. Rachel Moore navigated the thrumming sidewalks with practiced ease. The early evening light cast a golden glow over her tailored navy suit, a testament to her no-nonsense demeanor. As one of the city's most respected judges, Rachel commanded attention wherever she went, though she rarely sought it. Tonight, she allowed herself a rare indulgence: dinner at Tina's table, a cherished black-owned restaurant tucked away in the heart of the neighborhood. "Judge Moore," a voice called as she approached the entrance. Turning, Rachel spotted Tony Alvarez, the restaurant owner, a burly man with a warm smile that offset his gruff exterior. "Tony," Rachel greeted warmly, "I've been craving your collard greens all week." "Well, you've come to the right place," Tony replied, holding the door open for her. "Your table's ready." The dining room exuded a cozy, familial charm, its walls adorned with photographs of local luminaries and vibrant artwork celebrating Black heritage. Rachel settled into her seat near the window, relishing the momentary reprieve from her demanding schedule. Yet, as she scanned the room, a disquieting presence caught her attention. In the far corner of the restaurant stood Officer Paul Stanton, his imposing frame clad in the crisp blues of the city's police department. To the untrained eye, Paul might have appeared as the model of law enforcement, clean-cut, confident, and charismatic. But Rachel knew better. Stories of Paul's heavy-handed tactics and veiled threats had reached her courtroom on more than one occasion. Though his victims rarely dared to testify, Paul's predatory gaze swept the room, landing on Rachel. A smirk tugged at his lips as he sauntered over, his boots thudding against the hardwood floor. Well, if it isn't the Honorable Judge Moore," Paul drawled, his voice dripping with mock civility. "Didn't expect to see you here." Rachel met his gaze without flinching. "Officer Stanton, to what do we owe the pleasure?" Paul leaned against her table, his proximity uncomfortably close. "Just checking in on my favorite local spots. Gotta make sure everything's running smoothly." Tony, observing the interaction from the bar, clenched his fists. He started toward them, but Rachel raised a hand, subtly signaling him to stay put. "Everything's fine here," Rachel said evenly, her tone a masterclass in controlled authority. "Enjoy your evening." Paul lingered, his smirk deepening. "I always do, Judge." The night spiraled into chaos when Paul's attention shifted to a young waitress carrying a tray of drinks. Her name was Angela Hayes, a striking woman with deep brown eyes and an air of quiet resilience. As she passed Paul, he grabbed her wrist. "Hey there, sweetheart," Paul said, his voice low and menacing. "Why don't you take a break and keep me company?" Angela froze, her face a mask of composure despite the panic flashing in her eyes. "I'm working," she replied curtly, trying to pull away. Paul tightened his grip. "Don't be rude." "Now." Rachel rose from her seat, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Let her go." "Officer Stanton." Paul turned slowly, his expression darkening. "Stay out of this, Judge." "I will not," Rachel said firmly. "Let her go." The restaurant fell silent, all eyes on the standoff. Paul released Angela with a sneer, turning his full attention to Rachel. "You've got a lot of nerve, and you've overstepped your bounds." Rachel retorted. "Leave, or I'll see to it that your actions are reported." Paul's composure cracked. In a flash of rage, he swung his fist, striking Rachel across the face. Gasps erupted as Rachel stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The room suspended in collective shock. Paul's brazen attack sent shockwaves through the restaurant. Tony rushed to Rachel's side as Angela dialed 911. Paul, realizing the gravity of what he'd done, stormed out, leaving a trail of stunned silence in his wake. Rachel straightened, her jaw set with a steely determination. "I'm fine," she assured Tony, though the bruise forming on her cheek said otherwise. "But this won't go unanswered." Word of the incident spread like wildfire. By morning, the community was abuzz, with activists and local leaders demanding accountability. For Rachel, the assault wasn't just personal, it was emblematic of the systemic abuses she had spent her career fighting against. By morning, The story was everywhere. Local news outlets ran headlines like, "Prominent Judge Assaulted by Police Officer," and "Officer Accused of Violence Against Respected Community Leader." Social media exploded with outrage. The hashtags #Justice for Rachel and #Hold Paul Stanton Accountable trending within hours. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "End Police Brutality," and "Justice for All." The crowd was a mix of students, activists, and everyday citizens who had grown tired of seeing power wielded as a weapon against the vulnerable. Rachel stood by her window. Watching the crowd grow, she felt a mixture of gratitude and unease. The support was heartening, but she knew the road ahead would be treacherous. Her phone buzzed. It was her best friend, Elena Price, a sharp and relentless attorney who had made a name for herself tackling high-profile civil rights cases. "Rachel," Elena said without preamble, "you're pressing charges, right?" Rachel hesitated. "You know how these things go. They'll smear me, make this about my temperament. Your race." Elena interjected bluntly. "That's exactly why you need to do this. If you stay silent, he wins, and so does every other Paul Stanton out there." Rachel sighed. "Come over. I need your help." Paul Stanton sat in his modest suburban home, watching the news coverage with a scowl. His wife, Karen Stanton, hovered in the background, her expression torn between disbelief and concern. "This is ridiculous," Paul muttered, tossing the remote onto the couch. "That woman's blowing this way out of proportion." Karen hesitated. "Paul, you did hit her." Paul whipped around, his face darkening. "She provoked me. You don't get it. Women like her think they can run the world. Someone had to put her in her place." Karen flinched but said nothing. Paul's words were venomous, but they weren't new. She had spent years making excuses for his behavior, convincing herself that his anger was just stress from the job. At the precinct, Paul's colleagues rallied around him, many believing his version of events. The department issued a vague statement promising an internal review. But behind closed doors, they strategized ways to protect one of their own. Paul began intimidating witnesses, showing up unannounced at their homes, a silent warning not to get involved. That evening, Elena arrived at Rachel's house armed with legal pads, case law books, and an unshakable determination. "Let's get to work," she said, setting her things on the dining table. "First step: documenting everything. I need your full account of what happened." Rachel recounted the events in painstaking detail, her voice steady despite the weight of the memories. Elena scribbled notes furiously, occasionally pausing to ask clarifying questions. When they finished, Elena leaned back in her chair. "This isn't just about you, Rachel. This is about every person who's been silenced, every victim too scared to fight back. We're going to hold him accountable, not just for what he did to you, but for everything he's done." Rachel nodded, a flicker of resolve igniting within her. "Let's do it." The following day, Rachel attended a community meeting at a local church. The room was packed, the air buzzing with a mix of anger and determination. Community leaders, activists, and residents all spoke passionately about the need for change. Tony Alvarez, the restaurant owner who had witnessed the assault, took the microphone. "We've put up with this for too long," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "Paul Stanton has been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. Rachel's courage is our chance to finally stand up to him." Angela Hayes, the waitress Paul had harassed, shared her own experience. "He's been coming to the restaurant for months, making inappropriate comments, threatening us if we didn't comply with his demands. I'm done being scared." The stories poured out, each one painting a damning picture of Paul's reign of intimidation. By the end of the meeting, the room had coalesced into a unified force, ready to fight back. As the days passed, pressure on the police department grew. Civil rights organizations demanded a thorough investigation, and city officials faced mounting scrutiny. Behind the scenes, Rachel and Elena worked tirelessly to build their case. They filed an official complaint with the city's Civilian Oversight Board, detailing not only Paul's assault on Rachel but also the broader pattern of corruption and abuse he represented. Elena reached out to Detective Samuel Carter, an officer known for his integrity, hoping he might provide inside information. Meanwhile, Rachel grappled with the personal toll of the fight. She received anonymous threats, and her courtroom was flooded with reporters looking for a sensational headline. Yet, through it all, she remained steadfast, Drawing strength from the people rallying around her, Rachel stood before the courthouse steps. Flanked by Elena and a group of local activists. The crowd below cheered as she approached the podium. She adjusted the microphone, her calm exterior belying the storm of emotions swirling within. "I'm here today not just for myself," Rachel began, her voice steady but charged with conviction. "I'm here for every person who has been silenced, threatened, or abused by those sworn to protect us. Today, I'm filing criminal charges against Officer Paul Stanton for assault and abuse of power." The crowd erupted into applause. Cameras clicked, capturing the moment as Rachel turned and entered the courthouse, her resolve unwavering. Inside, Elena handed her the paperwork, and together they submitted the formal complaint. "This is just the beginning," Elena whispered as they exited the clerk's office. "Now comes the real fight." Paul Stanton paced the precinct like a caged animal, his anger barely contained. News of Rachel's charges had spread fast, and while his colleagues expressed outward solidarity, Paul sensed their unease. A few glanced at him with thinly veiled judgment, as though his actions had made their jobs harder. In his office, his superior, Captain Douglas Reeve, summoned him. Reeve was an older man, grizzled and weary, his decades on the force etched into every line on his face. "This is a PR nightmare," Reeve began, tossing a copy of the charges onto his desk. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Paul scoffed. "I've done my job. That woman's trying to ruin me because she can't handle a little authority." Reeve's jaw tightened. "We're launching an internal investigation. I suggest you find yourself a good lawyer." Paul left the office seething. He had spent years building his reputation, however crooked, and he wasn't about to let it crumble. He began contacting his network of allies, determined to turn the tables on Rachel. Rachel's legal team, led by Elena, worked tirelessly to compile evidence against Paul. Their office became a war room, walls covered in charts and timelines detailing Paul's history of misconduct. "We need witnesses," Elena said one evening, pinning another name to the board. "People who've experienced his abuse firsthand." "Good luck with that," said Michael Chen, a young associate on their team. "Most people are too scared to come forward." "Then we'll make them feel safe," Rachel interjected. "We'll show them they're not alone." Their breakthrough came when Angela Hayes, the waitress from the restaurant, agreed to testify. Her account of Paul's harassment and threats was damning, and her courage inspired others to step forward. Soon, they had a list of victims willing to share their stories, each one painting a clearer picture of Paul's abuses. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation as Rachel's case against Paul Stanton went before a judge for the first time. Rachel sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Elena and their team. Across the aisle, Paul sat with his attorney, Martin Greer, a slick and seasoned defense lawyer known for twisting the truth. Judge Miriam Sloan presided over the hearing. Stern but fair, she reviewed the evidence presented by both sides before making her decision. "This court finds sufficient evidence to proceed to trial," she announced. "Officer Paul Stanton, you will be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome." Paul's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. As Rachel exited the courtroom, reporters swarmed her, shouting questions. She paused just long enough to deliver a simple, powerful statement. "This is not just my fight, it's our fight. Justice will prevail." Paul, enraged by the charges, began a campaign to discredit Rachel. With the help of his lawyer, he leaked misleading stories to the press, painting Rachel as a vindictive woman targeting him for personal gain. Pundits debated the case endlessly, with some accusing Rachel of overstepping her role as a judge. The attacks took a toll. Rachel's reputation was called into question, and threats against her escalated. One night, she found a brick thrown through her living room window. The words, "Drop the case," scrawled across it in red paint. But Rachel refused to back down. She met with community leaders, organized public forums, and continued building her case with unwavering determination. In the midst of the chaos, Rachel and Elena received an unexpected visit from Detective Samuel Carter, a respected officer with a spotless record. Carter had grown disillusioned with the corruption within the department. "I'm tired of standing by while people like Paul tarnish what this badge is supposed to stand for," Carter said, his voice heavy with resolve. "I want to help." Carter provided crucial inside information about Paul's activities, including evidence of falsified reports and illegal searches. His testimony added significant weight to the case. and his decision to step forward inspired hope within Rachel's team. As the trial date approached, tensions in the city reached a boiling point. Protests outside the courthouse grew larger, with counter-demonstrators clashing with activists. The media frenzy intensified, and Rachel found herself at the center of a national conversation about race, power, and justice. Despite the mounting pressure, Rachel remained steadfast. One evening, she stood before a crowd at a community rally, her voice ringing with conviction. "This is not just about one officer or one case," she said. "This is about holding a broken system accountable. Together, we can create a future where justice is truly blind." As the trial approached, the city's tensions became impossible to ignore. On one side, Rachel's supporters rallied for justice, demanding accountability for Paul Stanton and systemic reform within the police department. On the other, factions emerged defending Paul, framing him as a victim of a political witch hunt. The streets were alive with protests. Marches supporting Rachel stretched for blocks, with banners reading, "Justice for Rachel," "No more abuse of power," and "End racism in law enforcement." Across the city, counter-protesters held signs declaring, "Support our police," and "Law and order first." Rachel watched the news from her living room, her face illuminated by the television screen. The sight of the polarized city, each group shouting over the other, weighed heavily on her. This wasn't just about her or Paul anymore. It was a battle for the city's soul. The media fanned the flames of division. On talk shows and social media, pundits debated the case endlessly. Rachel was alternately hailed as a hero and vilified as an opportunist exploiting the system for personal gain. Paul's defenders painted him as a hard-working cop whose reputation was being unfairly tarnished. One evening, Rachel's phone buzzed with a message from Elena. "Turn on Channel 7. Now." Rachel switched to the local news, where Paul's lawyer, Martin Greer, was giving an exclusive interview. Greer spoke with practiced charisma, casting doubt on Rachel's motives. "Officer Stanton is an exemplary member of our police force," Greer said smoothly. "This case is about more than just one incident. It's about a power-hungry judge attempting to weaponize the legal system." Elena called moments later, her voice filled with frustration. "We need to counter this narrative. Rachel, if they control the story, we'll lose the court of public opinion before we even set foot in the courtroom." Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "Let's organize a press conference. It's time to remind people what this fight is really about." A week later, Rachel stood at a podium outside City Hall, flanked by Elena, Angela Hayes, and Detective Samuel Carter. A throng of reporters jostled for position. Cameras trained on Rachel as she began to speak. "This case is not about me," she said, her voice firm. "It's about justice. It's about holding those in power accountable when they abuse the trust we place in them. Officer Stanton's actions are part of a larger pattern that cannot be ignored. I am not seeking revenge, I am seeking the truth." Detective Carter stepped forward, adding his voice to the fight. "As a police officer, I took an oath to serve and protect. That oath is meaningless if we allow corruption and abuse to go unchecked. Officer Stanton's actions do not reflect the values of the badge." The press conference dominated headlines for days, shifting the narrative back in Rachel's favor. But it also deepened the divide, with Paul's defenders doubling down on their support. The backlash against Rachel grew more personal. Anonymous threats arrived in the mail, warning her to drop the case. One letter included a photograph of her home, the implication chillingly clear. Meanwhile, Paul's allies within the department worked to sabotage Rachel's case. Evidence disappeared from records, and witnesses were intimidated into silence. Even Detective Carter found himself ostracized, his colleagues viewing him as a traitor. Elena grew increasingly concerned. "They're trying to isolate us," she said one evening, pacing Rachel's office. "We need to stay ahead of them. If they think they can intimidate us into backing down, they're wrong." Rachel nodded, though the strain was evident in her eyes. "We can't let fear win. This case is bigger than us." The polarization seeped into everyday life. Families argued over dinner tables. Neighbors avoided eye contact, and friendships unraveled as people chose sides. Schools and workplaces became battlegrounds for debates about race, power, and justice. The city council held an emergency meeting to address the growing unrest. Rachel attended as an observer, sitting quietly in the back as council members debated proposed police reforms. People are scared, one council member said. They're scared of the police, scared of each other, and scared of what this trial will mean for our city. Another member countered, we can't let fear dictate our actions. If we ignore these issues, we're complicit in the very injustice people are protesting against. Rachel left the meeting feeling both hopeful and weary. The road ahead was long, and the fractures in the city's foundation seemed deeper than ever amid the chaos. Moments of unity emerged. At a community rally, Angela Hayes took the stage to share her story. For years, I've been afraid to speak up, Angela said, her voice trembling but resolute. Afraid that no one would believe me, or that speaking out would make things worse. But Judge Moore's courage has shown me that silence is not the answer. We have to fight, for ourselves and for the people who come after us. The crowd erupted in applause. Rachel, watching from the sidelines, felt a swell of pride. Angela's bravery reminded her why she had taken this stand in the first place. After the rally, Rachel approached Angela. Your voice is powerful, she said. Don't ever doubt that. Angela smiled, her confidence growing. Neither should you, Judge. As the trial date loomed, the city seemed to hold its breath. Protests continued, but a sense of anticipation hung heavy in the air. Everyone knew the trial would be a turning point, not just for Rachel and Paul, but for the city itself. Rachel spent the days leading up to the trial preparing tirelessly with Elena and their team. Late one night, as they reviewed their evidence, Elena turned to Rachel. Do you ever regret it? Elena asked softly. Taking this fight on? Rachel looked up, her expression thoughtful. Regret? No. Fear? Every day. But I'd rather face fear than live with regret. The pretrial discovery phase was an uphill battle. Elena and her team sifted through mountains of paperwork, subpoenas, and witness testimonies, searching for the thread that would unravel Paul Stanton's carefully constructed facade. The turning point came one evening when Michael Chen, the youngest associate on the team, burst into the office holding a file. His face was flushed with excitement. You're not going to believe this, he said, dropping the file onto Elena's desk. Inside were records of complaints against Paul Stanton, buried in the archives of the police department. They detailed years of misconduct, excessive force, threats, and extortion. Most had been dismissed due to lack of evidence or quietly settled out of court. This shows a pattern, Elena said, flipping through the documents. It's not just about what he did to Rachel. He's been doing this for years. Detective Samuel Carter had been a quiet but steady ally, offering insight into the inner workings of the precinct. But one night, he arrived at Elena's office with more than just words. I found this in the archives, Carter said, placing a thumb drive on the desk. It's everything they didn't want you to see. The files included emails, internal memos, and surveillance footage that painted a damning picture of Paul. One video showed him shaking down a local business owner for protection money. Another revealed him falsifying evidence in a drug case. Rachel watched the footage with a mix of anger and resolve. This is the smoking gun we needed. Carter nodded. But it won't be enough. Stanton's got people on the inside protecting him. They'll do everything they can to discredit this. Elena's eyes narrowed. Then we'll make sure they can't. The team's newfound evidence emboldened witnesses who had been hesitant to come forward. Angela Hayes gave a detailed deposition about Paul's harassment and threats. Marcus Johnson, a small business owner, recounted how Paul had extorted him for years, threatening to shut down his shop if he didn't pay. But the most unexpected testimony came from Officer Linda Myers, a veteran cop who had worked alongside Paul for years. Linda described a culture of silence within the precinct, where officers who spoke out were ostracized, or worse. I've stayed quiet for too long, Linda said during her deposition. I'm not proud of it, but I'm done being afraid. Her testimony was a game changer, providing a first-hand account of Paul's abuses and the systemic corruption that enabled him as Rachel's case grew stronger. Paul and his lawyer, Martin Greer, went on the offensive. They filed motions to suppress evidence, claiming it was obtained illegally. Greer also orchestrated a smear campaign, leaking stories to the press that painted Rachel as overly ambitious and vindictive. One particularly vicious headline read, "Judge Moore's Vendetta. Is this about justice or power?" Rachel's team worked tirelessly to counter the narrative. They organized community meetings, released statements, and doubled down on their message. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. But the pressure was unrelenting. One night, Rachel returned home to find graffiti sprayed across her front door. "Drop the case or else." She stared at the words, her jaw tightening. The fear was real, but it only fueled her determination. Just as the team thought they had uncovered everything, Michael Chen stumbled upon another bombshell. Buried in the files was a report linking Paul Stanton to a high-profile unsolved case from years earlier, the suspicious death of Jamal Rivers, a young black man who had died in police custody. The autopsy report, long hidden, revealed signs of foul play. Witness statements suggested Paul had been involved, but the investigation had been quietly closed. Rachel's stomach churned as she read the report. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about Jamal, about everyone who's been hurt by him." Elena nodded grimly. "We need to make this part of the case. It shows his pattern of violence and the system's complicity." The revelation about Jamal Rivers ignited a firestorm. Protests grew larger, with demonstrators chanting his name alongside Rachel's. The media couldn't ignore the story, and the national spotlight turned to the city. Paul, meanwhile, grew more desperate. He tried to intimidate Carter, cornering him in the precinct parking lot one night. "You think you're a hero?" Paul sneered. "You're just a traitor." Carter stood his ground. "And you're done, Stanton. You just don't know it yet." With the trial date looming, Rachel's team worked around the clock. They refined their arguments, prepared witnesses, and rehearsed opening statements. Every detail had to be perfect. There was no room for error. Elena gathered the team for a final meeting. "This trial isn't just about winning," she said. "It's about exposing the truth. No matter what happens, we've already made an impact." Rachel looked around the room, her eyes lingering on each face. "Thank you," she said, "for believing in this fight. Let's finish what we started." The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters lined the back walls, their pens poised over notebooks, while protesters outside chanted for justice. Rachel sat at the plaintiff's table, her expression calm but resolute. Beside her, Elena reviewed her notes one final time. Judge Miriam Sloan entered, her gavel striking the sound block to bring the room to order. "This court is now in session. The People versus Officer Paul Stanton." Martin Greer rose first, his polished demeanor on full display. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth and persuasive. "This case is not what it seems. My client is an honorable officer who has dedicated his life to protecting this community. The accusations against him are nothing more than a coordinated attack by individuals with their own agendas." Elena stood next, her tone measured but impassioned. "This trial is about accountability. It's about a man who abused his power. Not just once, but repeatedly, and the system that allowed him to do so. Today, we will present undeniable evidence of Officer Stanton's misconduct and give voice to those who have been silenced." The stage was set. The prosecution called its first witness, Angela Hayes, nervously adjusting the microphone. Angela recounted the harassment she endured from Paul Stanton, her voice trembling but determined. "He would come to the restaurant almost every week," Angela said. "He'd make inappropriate comments, threaten us, and demand free meals. When I tried to stand up to him, he grabbed me. He said no one would believe me if I reported him." Elena guided her through the testimony, her questions drawing out the full extent of Angela's ordeal. Greer's cross-examination, however, was ruthless. "Miss Hayes," Greer said, leaning forward, "isn't it true that you've had financial difficulties in the past? Perhaps this lawsuit is about money, not justice." Angela's voice didn't waver. "This isn't about money. It's about stopping him from hurting anyone else." The courtroom buzzed as Angela stepped down, her courage leaving a lasting impression. Detective Samuel Carter took the stand next. The tension in the room was palpable as he described the culture of corruption within the precinct and detailed Paul's history of misconduct. Officer Stanton operated with impunity, Carter testified. Complaints were buried, evidence was tampered with, and witnesses were intimidated. It wasn't just him, it was a system that protected him. Elena presented the emails and surveillance footage Carter had uncovered. The jury watched as video after video showed Paul shaking down business owners, falsifying reports, and using excessive force. When Greer cross-examined Carter, his strategy was clear: discredit the whistleblower. "Detective Carter," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism, "you claim to uphold justice. Yet you stayed silent for years. Why speak out now?" Carter met his gaze. Because I realized silence makes me complicit. It's time for the truth to come out. The trial reached its crescendo when Elena introduced the case of Jamal Rivers. The courtroom fell silent as she presented the autopsy report and witness statements linking Paul to the young man's death. This is not an isolated incident, Elena said, her voice ringing with conviction. This is a pattern of abuse that has gone unchecked for far too long. Paul's composure cracked for the first time. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the evidence mounted against him. Greer tried to downplay the new revelations, but the jury's unease was evident. On the advice of his lawyer, Paul took the stand to defend himself. He wore a mask of righteous indignation, portraying himself as a victim of false accusations. I've spent my entire career serving this community, Paul said, his voice heavy with feigned sincerity. Yes, I've made mistakes. Who hasn't? But these allegations are exaggerated, and some are outright lies. Elena's cross-examination was surgical. Officer Stanton, she began, her tone calm but unyielding. Can you explain why multiple witnesses, independent of one another, have testified to your threats and harassment? They're lying, Paul said, his frustration seeping through. Elena stepped closer. And the surveillance footage? The falsified reports? Are they lying too? Paul faltered, his polished exterior crumbling. I can't explain that. In her closing argument, Elena addressed the jury with a mixture of passion and precision. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the testimonies. This case is not about punishing one man. It's about saying enough is enough. It's about standing up for justice, for those who have been silenced and for the future of this community. Greer's closing statement leaned heavily on casting doubt. The burden of proof is on the prosecution, he reminded the jury, and they have failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Officer Stanton committed these crimes. The jury left to deliberate, the weight of the city's hopes resting on their shoulders. Hours turned into a full day before the jury returned. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson handed the verdict to Judge Sloan. Rachel gripped the edge of the table, her heart pounding. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of extortion, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of misconduct leading to the death of Jamal Rivers, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Paul's face fell, his once smug demeanor replaced with shock. Outside, cheers from the gathered crowd echoed through the city as Paul was led away in handcuffs. Rachel allowed herself a moment of quiet relief. The trial had been grueling, but the outcome was a testament to the power of truth and perseverance. Elena hugged Rachel tightly. You did it, she said. We did it. Rachel looked out the window at the crowd chanting her name. This was more than a victory in court, it was a victory for the community. A step toward justice in a broken system. The city erupted in celebration following the verdict. Streets were filled with jubilant crowds chanting Rachel's name, holding signs that read, "Justice for Jamal," and "Accountability wins." Yet, amidst the cheers, Rachel sat quietly in her office, gazing at the piles of case files and legal briefs that had defined the past months. Elena walked in, holding 2 mugs of coffee. You should be out there celebrating, she said, handing one to Rachel. Rachel smiled faintly. It's a victory, but it doesn't feel complete. Paul Stanton is just one man. The system that enabled him is still standing. Elena sat across from her. One step at a time. This trial didn't just hold him accountable, it started a conversation. Rachel, people are listening. Rachel nodded, feeling the weight of both triumph and responsibility. Paul Stanton's life unraveled quickly. Stripped of his badge and sentenced to 20 years in prison, he became a pariah. Former allies distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his downfall. Even his lawyer, Martin Greer, moved on to other cases. His public statements about Paul growing increasingly neutral. In prison, Paul faced a reckoning of his own. Surrounded by those he had once terrorized, he realized the depth of his isolation. Letters from his estranged wife, Karen, stopped coming after a few months, and visits from family dwindled to nothing. For the first time, Paul was forced to confront the consequences of his actions, without the shield of power to protect him weeks after the trial. Rachel stood before a packed auditorium at a community event organized by local activists. The room buzzed with energy, a mix of gratitude and determination. This verdict was a victory. Rachel began, her voice steady, but it was not the end. It was a vital step, toward dismantling a system that has perpetuated injustice for far too long. Real change requires all of us. Together, demanding better. The crowd erupted in applause. But Rachel's gaze lingered on the faces before her. She saw hope, but also the scars of battles still being fought. She knew her role wasn't over. It had only just begun. The trial's outcome sparked widespread calls for reform. Under mounting public pressure, the city council implemented several measures. Independent oversight. A civilian review board was established to investigate complaints against law enforcement. Body cameras. All officers were mandated to wear body cameras, with footage accessible to the public in cases of misconduct. Community policing. Programs were introduced to rebuild trust between the police and the communities they served. Rachel worked closely with activists and city leaders to ensure these reforms were more than just symbolic gestures. Her experience gave her a unique perspective, and she used it to advocate for policies that prioritized accountability and equity. Angela Hayes, once a quiet waitress afraid to speak out, became a prominent voice in the fight for justice. She began working with a local advocacy group, sharing her story to inspire others. At a rally, Angela stood before a crowd, her voice filled with newfound confidence. "I never thought my voice mattered. But Judge Moore showed me that standing up is the first step toward change. If I can do it, so can you." Rachel watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. Angela's courage was a testament to the ripple effects of justice. The restaurant where it all began, Tina's Table, became a symbol of resilience. Business flourished as people flocked to support the establishment that had stood at the center of a historic case. Tony Alvarez, the owner, expanded his efforts to uplift the community, hosting legal aid clinics and fundraisers. "This place is more than just a restaurant," Tony said during an interview. "It's a reminder that when we stand together, we can make a difference." One evening, Rachel visited the grave of Jamal Rivers. She placed a bouquet of white lilies at the base of the headstone, her thoughts heavy with the weight of his story. "I hope this brings you some peace," she whispered. "Your name won't be forgotten. Not ever." As she stood in the quiet cemetery, a sense of clarity washed over her. The fight for justice was far from over. But for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Elena joined Rachel at her office late one night, a thick file in hand. "You're not going to believe this," she said, dropping it on Rachel's desk. Inside were details of another officer, another case of abuse buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. Rachel scanned the file, her expression shifting from weariness to determination. "Looks like we've got work to do," Rachel said, a small smile forming. Elena grinned. "You in?" "Always," Rachel replied. Paul Stanton sat in the stark confines of his prison cell, staring at the ceiling. Gone was the commanding officer who once ruled his precinct with an iron fist. Inside these walls, he was just another inmate, stripped of the power and privilege he had once abused. Paul's past haunted him. He thought of the faces of those he had wronged: Angela Hayes, Jamal Rivers, Rachel Moore, and for the first time, a flicker of guilt surfaced. The man who once thrived on control now found himself at the mercy of others. One day, during a quiet moment in the yard, an older inmate approached him. Hector Ramirez, a former activist turned prison mentor, leaned against the fence. "Regret eats you alive if you let it," Hector said, his voice steady. "But it's a choice. You either wallow in it, or you try to make amends." Paul didn't respond, but Hector's words stayed with him. In the months following the trial, Rachel became a leading voice for systemic reform. Invitations poured in for her to speak at universities, conferences, and panels. Despite her busy schedule, she remained deeply involved in the community. At one event, Rachel addressed a crowd of law students. "Justice isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about balance. It's about ensuring that power is wielded responsibly and that those who abuse it are held accountable." Her words resonated deeply, inspiring a new generation of legal minds to join the fight for equity. Back in Paul's suburban neighborhood, his wife, Karen, struggled to rebuild her life. She had filed for divorce shortly after the trial, unable to reconcile her love for the man she had married with the truth about his actions. One afternoon, Karen received a letter from Paul. It was the first time he had reached out since the trial. In shaky handwriting, he apologized, not just to her, but to the people he had hurt. Karen sat at her kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands, though she couldn't forgive him fully. It was a small step toward closure. Angela Hayes, now a recognized advocate for justice, found herself in the national spotlight. She was invited to share her story on a major news program, where she spoke about the courage it took to stand up against Paul Stanton. "It wasn't just me," Angela said during the interview. "It was the community. Rachel Moore, Elena Price, and so many others gave me the strength to fight back. This isn't about one case, it's about changing a broken system." Her words sparked a new wave of activism, with people across the country rallying behind her message in Rachel's city. Change was slow but tangible. The Civilian Review Board began investigating cases of police misconduct, and for the first time, officers were held accountable for their actions. Community programs flourished, fostering trust between residents and law enforcement. At a town hall meeting, Tony Alvarez spoke passionately about the importance of unity. "This fight isn't over," he said, "but we've proven that when we come together, we're unstoppable." Rachel watched from the back of the room, her heart swelling with pride. The seeds of change she had helped plant were beginning to grow. Months turned into years. Paul Stanton, now a shadow of his former self, approached Hector Ramirez in the prison library. "You said I had a choice." Paul began hesitantly. "I want to do something, to try and make things right." Hector nodded. "Start by listening. Learn from the people you hurt." Paul began attending restorative justice sessions, where inmates and victims shared their stories. At first, he found it unbearable, but over time, he began to understand the depth of the pain he had caused. Redemption wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time, Paul was trying. Rachel stood on the steps of a newly opened legal aid center, cutting the ribbon alongside Elena and Angela. The center, funded by donations from the community and national organizations, aimed to provide free legal assistance to underserved populations. "This isn't just a building," Rachel said during the opening ceremony. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we refuse to accept injustice. Together, we're creating a future where everyone has access to the justice they deserve." The crowd erupted into applause, the moment a culmination of years of struggle and perseverance. One evening, Rachel returned to Tina's table for dinner. The restaurant was bustling, its walls now adorned with photos and memorabilia from the trial and the movement it had inspired. Tony greeted her with a broad smile. "You're a legend, you know," he said, sliding a plate of collard greens onto her table. Rachel chuckled. "I'm just a part of something bigger." As she ate, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The fight for justice was far from over, but she had no doubt that the community was stronger, more united, and ready for whatever came next. Years after the trial, the city bore the marks of transformation. Streets once filled with protests now hosted community events celebrating diversity and progress. Rachel's trial had become a touchstone in the broader movement for justice, inspiring similar cases across the country. Journalists revisited the case, calling it a landmark moment in the fight against police misconduct. Documentaries were made, highlighting the bravery of Rachel, Angela, and others who had stood against the odds. The trial was no longer just a legal battle, it was a catalyst for nationwide change. Rachel stood in the chambers of the state Supreme Court, her black robe a symbol of the trust the public had placed in her. After years of serving as a judge in her city, Rachel had been appointed to the state's highest court, her reputation as a fighter for justice paving the way. At her swearing-in ceremony, Rachel spoke with characteristic humility. "This honor is not mine alone," she said. "It belongs to the community that believed in me, the people who stood up for what's right, and the countless voices that demanded justice." Among the attendees were Elena, Angela, and Tony, their pride evident as they watched their friend ascend to new heights in a quiet corner of the prison. Paul Stanton sat across from a young man in a restorative justice session. The man, one of Paul's many victims, shared his story of how Paul's abuse had nearly destroyed his family. For once, Paul didn't interrupt or deflect. He listened, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. When the session ended, Paul approached the young man. "I'm sorry," Paul said, his voice hoarse. "I know it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that." The man nodded, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. It wasn't closure, but it was a step, a small sign that even the most broken people could begin to change. Angela Hayes became a force in her own right. founding a nonprofit organization called Voices for Justice, which supported victims of police misconduct and systemic racism. Under her leadership, the organization grew into a national network, providing legal aid, counseling, and advocacy. At a gala celebrating the nonprofit's success, Angela took the stage. "We are all stronger than we know," she said. "Standing up isn't easy, but it's necessary. Together, we can change the world." Rachel, seated in the audience, felt a swell of pride. Angela's transformation was one of the greatest victories of the journey they had shared. At a community center event, Rachel sat with a group of young law students, answering their questions about her career and the challenges she had faced. A young woman named Maya Johnson raised her hand. "What kept you going when everything seemed impossible?" Rachel smiled. "Belief, not in myself, but in the idea that justice is worth fighting for, no matter the cost, and in the people who stood with me. None of us can do this alone." Maya nodded, her expression thoughtful. Rachel saw the spark of determination in her eyes. A reminder that the fight would continue with the next generation. The city unveiled a memorial in honor of Jamal Rivers and others who had lost their lives to systemic injustice. The sculpture, a striking piece of art depicting a rising phoenix, stood in the heart of the city as a symbol of resilience and hope. Rachel attended the ceremony, laying a wreath at the base of the memorial. She stood in silence, reflecting on the lives lost and the battles fought. Beside her, Angela placed her hand on Rachel's shoulder. "This is what it's all for," Angela said softly. "For them, for everyone who comes after." Over the years, Rachel witnessed the broader impact of the movement she had helped spark. Police reforms became standard practice in cities across the country, and public trust in law enforcement began to slowly rebuild. Though challenges remained, Rachel took comfort in the progress she had seen. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better, thanks to the collective effort of countless individuals who refused to give up years later. Rachel visited Tina's table once again. The restaurant was as vibrant as ever, filled with laughter and conversation. Tony greeted her with his familiar warmth, guiding her to her favorite table. As Rachel looked around, she felt a deep sense of peace. The city, once divided, now felt like a community again. The road to justice was long, but moments like this reminded her that the journey was worth it. She picked up her fork, savoring the meal before her, and allowed herself to simply be. For the first time in a long time, Rachel felt the quiet joy of a battle well fought. Rachel's story became a beacon of hope and a reminder that justice, though elusive, is always worth pursuing. Her life's work inspired others to take up the mantle, ensuring that the fight for equality and accountability would continue. And though Rachel never sought the spotlight, her name would be remembered as a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what is right.